Okay, so we've got our keynote speakers who were able to stay with us. First of all, before we do the wrap-up, I have to say, excellent job from everybody. And what a myriad, what a huge spectrum of topics today. And I think we should give them a round of applause, right? I mean, we've learned a lot today. Excellent. Excellent. And let's just start by taking a stab at what we think we've learned today. Jed, you're at the end. Let me ask you, what did we learn today, maybe, or what did you learn today that you didn't know coming into this? Well, what struck you the most?
I think what I'm taking away from the discussion today is a renewed appreciation of the connection between strategy, practice, and knowledge creation. And the fact that what you think you're going to do may end up being something different, but if you position yourself well with stakeholders, if you open yourself to learning forward, failing forward, in the process of managing the execution of your strategy, that actually you have the greatest possibility to optimize the value of what it is you're trying to create.
Okay, excellent.
Well, I think what matters most to me, at least, is that we link up the content of our work with the way we communicate it, and that we clearly try to establish high-trust relationships if we really want to achieve something in research. Because without that, we will not have the best possible applicants.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Volker?
I think this has been a good description during the whole day of these constant learning processes. Sia, you mentioned it explicitly, that are implied when it comes to executing a good strategy. It is not just writing a blueprint and then ignoring the world for the next 2 years. It is a constant learning exercise that should involve the whole organization, not just one or the other leadership levels.
Mm-hmm. Sia?
Thanks. I think I learned, the value of applying different perspectives to the same kind of work that we're all trying to do. So even within the realm of brand and communications, to hear it from sort of the academic research that you've done on brand and the practice of what you're doing at the foundation was hugely helpful on that topic. And that applies to everyone's sort of different perspectives on this common thing we're trying to do.
Natalie?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, great. So one of the things that shone through me for all of the presentations and the day that we've been spending together is this notion of partnerships and collaboration as really essential to achieving what we're all here for. And so this notion of partnerships is really a thread, and collaboration is really a thread that runs through everything that we've talked about today in terms of being able to have the impact that we wish to have. And so it's interesting because collaboration actually means understanding yourself really well, because you can't collaborate effectively unless you have great clarity in terms of what your own objectives are. And I think some of that shone through today very effectively.
Mm-hmm. Mark?
I think that's absolutely right. I think there were probably two themes. One was the very interesting way in which I think there are sort of theoretical frameworks for that exist for some of the challenges I think we face as an organization, and I'm sure many of you do, that I wasn't necessarily familiar with. I thought Zia and Natalie especially were incredibly helpful with kind of helping to not answer, but help me to, I think I'll go back asking better questions as a result of hearing their presentations, which is great. And then the other thing that I think came through, really what everybody was saying, is focusing beyond the proximate goals of your organization to the ultimate goals, and actually trying, and Jed especially, but everybody I think was very much about actually what are you trying to achieve at the end of the day? How are you going to break it down into something that's actually achievable, and what tools are you going to use to do that?
I mean, there were some words that were thrown out today, some phrases today that really caught my eye or my ear. Successful impact investing, for example, analysis paralysis, strategy is a process, not the answer. Wicked problems, and I was also watching the audience too, and those were phrases, terms that came out that got people's attention. Let's ask the audience too. Do you think, after having heard what everyone said today, do you think enough is being done to collaborate? Are research foundations doing enough using each other and helping each other? Show of hands. Yes, you think enough is being done? All right, so the answer is no, not enough is being done, right? What needs to be done then? I mean, we've talked about how impressed we've been with this notion of collaboration. Exactly.
Yeah, well, could I suggest, I mean, if there were to be an effective federation or something, a pan-European foundation network that actually had a kind of clear achievement plan or clear mandate, who would be interested in joining that provisionally, realizing this isn't committing anybody, but would people find that a useful and helpful thing? Hands for who would?
They can't see? Well, what do you want me to do?
Okay, so not that many. Okay, that's interesting.
This lady over here. We need to get a microphone. Let's get a microphone to her.
Thank you. We already have these organizations actually, because we have Science Europe, who is the organization for the public funders in Europe, and then we have the European Foundation Center, who is the organization for the private foundations. So I think the important thing is to bring these two organizations together and then to strengthen the relationship and the collaboration and then to extend it. And then of course also extend all the collaboration among us, private-public foundations and everyone. But I think it would be unwise to create another research policy strategy organization in Europe because we already have too many.
Okay. That's a great comment right here.
Pekka Koponen from Spinverse Finland. I think it was a brave move to ask the audience that would you join this kind of federation. I think to get the proper answer, the value proposition should be better defined. That it's difficult to kind of, people don't understand what they need. It sounds like the research cooperation, pan-European cooperation works well, and for that kind of new initiative, you should focus on areas which are not managed well. For example, public-private partnerships, how to incubate more industry-driven challenges, and how to engage the industry that you own to solving those challenges. And I believe kind of research funding, it works just well. But then how to expand the impact to the surrounding society.
Okay, that's an interesting, yeah, Mr. Kroll, go ahead.
I think you are perfectly correct with respect to the research collaborations, which have, of course, a tradition of almost 30 years within the framework program, European Science Foundation, lots of other things. But for foundations themselves, this collaboration among research funders, in particular across borders, is still quite a new feature. And it takes, of course, let's say, not only a common interest or a common cause, actually, to join in, but also a certain degree, sorry to say, of modesty on behalf of each of the players. It involves fairness in dealing with one another, in also, and I think Natalie mentioned it briefly, being prepared to step back from your obsession with your own brand if it serves the common purpose, you know. And this kind of change of behavior is gradually emerging, and I could give you several examples from our foundation of the past 10 years, and even the one mentioned recently about Europe and global challenges. But it's a learning process, it's a cumbersome process, and it all depends on friendship, credibility, reliability, these kind of issues. If you don't deal with them up front, then you end up in a bureaucracy among foundations, just like among public institutions.
Volker?
I would like to endorse that statement and that argument made before, that we do not necessarily have to think about new organizations or new associations even. If we ask ourselves how we can imagine successful learning processes, we can only imagine them if we share certain values, if you share certain goals, and we then really sort of embark on specific ventures together. Conferences like this have a different role to play, a very important role, which is more on the level of building trust or building relationships and ties, and perhaps even raising issues on an agenda. But then the actual learning processes do not occur on an association level. They occur between groups of organizations, collaborations of organizations that have a shared agenda and really do it. And that would be our experience from an academic background, and I would endorse that also from my own professional experience in philanthropy.
What about the notion of private research foundations picking up the slack or the lack of research that is being dedicated by public institutions or agencies now? We touched on that briefly this morning, but because the world is so much more complex than it was even 10 years ago, the needs for research are so much more complex and diverse. Is there a greater need for private research foundations to do their work, and are they meeting that need? What would you say to that?
Well, it's something that we, I think, try very hard not to do, in that, as I think Wilhelm particularly said earlier, that substitution is not the role of the foundation, and indeed it would be very dangerous if that were to be the case. And indeed we, certainly at the Wellcome Trust, work very hard to ensure that our investment comes on top of public investment and is never seen as an excuse for cutting back public investment. I mean, we have a big advantage, which is we don't have one country mandate the way that certain foundations do. So I know, speaking to Fleming, the Carlsberg Foundation can only fund within Denmark, I understand, but we can fund anywhere we like. So actually, we fund a lot in the UK because we view some of it is historical, but I don't think it's historical forever. We currently view the UK as a good environment for research, and so our money goes a long way in the UK. Actually, if that were to stop, I think we would invest elsewhere instead. And so, yeah, we would be prepared to pull the money if we had to. What about the schizophrenia of research foundations? I hear, at every conference, time and time again, research foundations have the people who want to be on the cutting edge, who want to push society further, push research further. Yet inside the foundations, the way the foundations are structured, the way decision-making is structured, they are incredibly conservative and reluctant to change. What about that bifurcation, as we heard earlier today? Is there a way to maybe get around that? Zia?
So I think that's an interesting question. I think it's true of more than just research foundations, and it's true to one degree or another.
Yeah.
I think the problem is, if you think about risk, what you want to do is balance your failures with your successes. And the trick is the failures are very near-term, immediate, and you can put a dollar onto what grant funding was wasted. But the opportunity of success is unclear. So when you have Silicon Valley investors, they can very much think about, well, there's this probability that this number of companies will get to this valuation. And the success that we are all seeking is hard to quantify, but the cost is easy to quantify. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of a bias towards focusing on what you can measure. If we could come up with better ways to measure the potential impact, that would be very important. So just as a quick example, as was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, in the United States, we have to focus on spending 5% of our endowment. So we have lots of systems that are organized around making sure we spend 5%. If we had to instead account for improving, I'm making this up, but 100,000 lives every year,
right,
we would be organized very differently.
Okay.
We would be managing very differently. We'd be taking risks very differently as well.
Okay. Mr. Kroll, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, you see, in foundations, just as in universities, there are human beings, and human beings within their institutional setup are usually very reluctant to change. There is even this famous quotation from the once president of Princeton: restructuring a university or restructuring a cemetery leads up to the same result. There is no response from within. And I can tell you, I can tell you from my own experience with the Volkswagen Foundation, that even turning this into a learning organization and getting this across, everybody, of course, at the beginning was quite happy with it. And for us, of course, that meant to change the culture from just doing the assessment and the reviewing of applications towards putting our own activities also, exposing them to an evaluation. And I can tell you that caused a lot of controversy because people said, well, but we are doing things professionally, so why should we have somebody to look at us from the outside? We are autonomous, we are self-sufficient, so why is it necessary? And then to actually get across that this is essential if you really want to adapt to change, and that you then also, of course, within have to face up to certain changes. That's a cumbersome process and it has to be renewed every now and then. It's not something where you can just say, let's do it once and then it will happen.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to this point, I think it's fundamentally a question of leadership. And we've created this class of managers within philanthropy who manage the philanthropic process as opposed to leading engagement in the community in these fields of interest and really bringing a vision about what is the potential and possibilities. And I think it goes back to the comment made earlier about that you need to have managers who can lead and leaders who know how to manage effectively. But if you don't have the leadership piece, all you have is just transactive philanthropy, where you're simply making grants with no accountability or no real reference toward the ultimate goal and vision.
Yeah. Volker, there was one more comment you wanted to make.
Actually, as a social scientist, I feel prompted to remind us that if we were to substitute more for the role of the state, which was a question that you asked earlier on, that would be even more challenging for the position of foundations as learning organizations, because they would have to be responsive to different needs. The state has to be responsive ultimately to its voters.
Right.
And that means it's a 4-year period, it's voter preferences, and the consequence among our colleagues is that we have diagnosed state failure in certain cases. Because if you don't earn a majority for a proposition, it's unlikely to be sort of pushed through the political agenda.
But it is a valid question, though, isn't it? That the pressure from the public or from the state on private foundations is increasing every year to do more that the state 20, 30 years ago would have done.
Now, if already the state is plagued with state failure, the foundations would be well advised not to increase their risk of suffering from all the problems that any large-scale organization with its path dependencies and with its sort of structural blocks suffers from. And so I would suggest that we rather think about getting away from being a state-like organization, becoming a more bureaucratic organization, but that is challenging.
Yeah, but isn't the issue one of accountability? And the Achilles heel of the philanthropic structure and governance is that, you know, once you become a philanthropist, you never have a bad meal or a bad idea. Right? And we need to have...
Let me quote that one. Yeah.
We need to have, and this is where the whole role of stakeholder engagement becomes so critical, because if you really have meaningful relationships with the broader community, with the set of really the outside investors, if you will, the independent investors in the outcome of what it is that you're managing for, you at least have the possibility. You're not going to have the assurance of a positive outcome, but you've got a possibility of being able to be at least a little more honest. And then you could do things as, I think, Ford and some other foundations, where they actually rotate people through and out. So you're in for 6 to 10 years and you're gone. You don't have these permanent kind of roles where you can become so enamored of your own intelligence and ideas and vision that you completely lose track of any kind of accountability for outcome or impact.
What about the notion of transparency? I have written down here, foundations ought to be more transparent and they should strengthen their communication skills. Let me just ask the audience, when you think of private research foundations, do you think of them as being inherently transparent or transparent-loving organizations? No? Look at all your head shaking, yeah. I mean, it's a problem, right? Researchers, scientists are not known for wanting to open their doors and let everyone look inside. It's the same for foundations. Would you agree?
I think we heard earlier that, let's say, for instance, the Wellcome Trust, but also other institutions have learned quite some lessons, and that's why they do engage to such a large extent, not only in communicating science to the public at large, but also to become much more transparent, as I pointed out this morning, with respect to processes, with respect to when can we expect something is going to happen for us as applicants. But you see, it's an entire learning process, which is particularly connected, of course, these days with electronic communication and with the new opportunities opportunities also to get an interactive process early on, which we didn't have some 20 years ago. So there are, of course, rapid changes going on, but as far as I can see, this, let's say, notion of transparency is not one which you can consider in isolation. It has many other aspects to it, and it needs this kind of, let's say, comprehensive system of values and also of operations which you need in order to get this across.
Have you had to fight, though, to be more transparent at the Volkswagen Foundation?
Not so much at the Volkswagen Foundation, but as chairman of the German Association of Foundations, you see many smaller foundations, medium-sized foundations, criticize somebody from the Volkswagen Foundation or from the Bosch Foundation for having their staff in place in order to communicate, and they feel that there is now, from these larger ones, put a lot of pressure on them, which whilst they rather prefer to stay in a kind of secret environment, or as somebody said to me, you see, why should I be interested in having more people applying to us? This would imply more work. This would actually finally mean that I have to respond to more emails. I don't have the capacity for it. That's why I this morning said we have to also differentiate what could be done by whom within what scope, because otherwise, you see, we end up in just entertaining ourselves.
And I just want to add to that, transparency is a big topic, and I agree with you. You know, transparency does take time and effort, and also we could be completely transparent about everything that we're doing and no one would have any idea what we're doing because we would just have a bomb of information going out. I think it's more interesting to think about transparency to what end. So one end is accountability, so to share the failures and the data and make sure that, you know, it feels shameful to do things. Again, it doesn't quite create accountability, but at least it's one step forward. The more interesting aspect, I think, is transparency for engagement. So one thing, a metaphor I try and think about and that we're trying to change at the foundation is how can we become more of a porous organization? So we can hear more ideas and respond back with what we're thinking. Now that comes with all sorts of challenges. If you walk into a conference as a person who works at a foundation and say, I'm sort of interested in this idea, you will get bombed with proposals. And so you become very reluctant to think out loud. And so as much as people can criticize foundations for how they behave, those conditions are created by the environment where it makes it almost impossible for people at foundations to think out loud because of the consequences. So somehow there's a way where we can have more better dialogue that way.
I just wanted to add that I think also transparency can lead to learning, which was one of the themes that we talked about. And I think that's an important way to think about being transparent and clear so that we can learn and reflect on people's engagement and sort of building on this engagement piece. I also think that mission is fundamental. If you have clarity in your mission and your mandate, it really gives you a sense of what you should and should not do. I've often heard strategy being defined as what you don't do. And so being really clear on your mission really helps you, I think, understand to what extent you replace the government role or not, and it gives you a sense of who you should be engaging and how you should be engaging. There's another really interesting thing that's happening that I think can help in terms of collaboration, and you just touched on it, Zia, is this notion of organizational porosity. And what I mean by that is that organizational boundaries are increasingly porous, and what we end up doing is working with people who are not necessarily in our organizations. We form these ad hoc teams with people in other organizations and certainly in other sectors. And so this notion of creating value through these non-organizational kind of teams is something that we're going to see a lot more of, and I think is really interesting. But if you have to have your center, you have to have your core, and really be rooted in your mission in order to be able to do any of this other work effectively, I think. Yeah.
Let me ask the audience, just by a show of hands, do you feel better after what you heard today? Do you feel better about the notion of pushing your brand? Raise your hands. Look at this. My God. You guys definitely, you get paid this week, right? But what is it, this notion about brands? What did we learn today? from what Mark and Natalie were talking about. Is it something that has to be internalized more at foundations? Is it almost a taboo that has to be, de-tabooed?
I think it has to start with every organization knowing and understanding that you have a brand, whether you like it or not. And if you don't define it yourselves, somebody else is going to define it for you. And so you might as well get in there on the front foot and do it for yourselves and see it as an opportunity to invest in impact and outcome and something that you use to achieve your mission rather than something that can ultimately hold your mission back.
I've got a very Hamlet Danish sort of connection to make. So it's not, the question is not to brand or not to brand. That sort of, it's how to brand, right? And how to think about brand. So, I thought that was really nice, the Danish Hamlet thing.
Yeah, Sia, go ahead.
So and it's funny, when Natalie and I were doing our work together, we called it the B word, because it felt sensitive. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit more to it, and it is the fact that the word brand very much feels like something coming from the private sector.
Right. Yeah.
And people who have been working in the social sector are resenting some, and in some ways appropriately, all of this thinking of philanthropy needs to become more business-like. And there's this worship of private sector methodologies that's happening. So there's this kind of cultural undercurrent to resistance of brand. Because as soon as you call it influence, all the program says, yeah, of course, we understand that. Of course we'll do this. And everything is the same. It's just a slight reframing. So it's a little bit of a tip of the iceberg. And that's the unfortunate thing of, there's lots of good learnings, and the private sector could learn a lot about embracing complexity from the social sector that it needs to do now. There's a lot of interesting learnings, but we always have to recognize these words are loaded. Yeah. These are cultural differences. People have different values, et cetera.
Okay. Volker?
Well, I think I would want to reiterate what Natalie mentioned earlier on in her statement, and that is the core importance of trust for this issue. And I would make a claim that trust is even more relevant in a foundation context than it is in any brand context. For the sake of foundations, and it applies all the more to research foundations, having to base their claim at credibility on the substance that they can really offer. And if a research foundation cannot base its brand identity on a strong base of research evidence, I think it would be a highly risky exercise. So it is the substance, but then it is the trust-building exercise, because if foundations are trying to resolve wicked problems in society, and they're not in an executive position, they're not in a position where they enjoy democratic legitimacy, they're not in a position where they have members or other sort of constituencies that legitimize their activities. They can only rely on trust from a broad range of stakeholders. Okay. And therefore I would claim that brand identity in foundations is even more dependent on trust and on establishing and maintaining trust than in any other organization.
All right, so we picked up on trust, porosity. Go ahead, Mark.
Just a small point that may help. I completely agree. I think that's really, really important. I guess one way of framing that would be that I think what Natalie and I were talking about were more the kind of proactive, offensive, as it were, approaches to brand, but there's a defensive one too. That actually, if you've got strong brand equity out there, it makes you more resilient to crises, to pick up on what Zia was talking about in a different context. If you've got strong brand equity, you can get over a crisis of confidence or a bad publicity incident or something. If you haven't, then that can be potentially fatal.
What about the notion of research foundations being leaders versus research foundations being followers, or having the herd mentality? How many people here would say that their foundations tend to follow more than lead, particularly when it comes to deciding what they're going to support and deciding what topics are important for the foundation? Who are the leaders? All right, and who are the followers? Look at the honesty here. We are in Northern Europe. Great, great. I mean, that is something that I've also heard many times at conferences with foundations, is that people, the boards of foundations want to set a new path, but they're afraid to, because it's easy then to point to them and say, look, they made a mistake, they failed. How do you get beyond that and being not so, Or being more risk averse, yeah?
There's another one part of this that's important is if you really want sustained change, it doesn't come as an individual kind of stepping forward, but with a group. Right. And so the trick becomes, how do you lead from the middle of the conga line? Right? And how do you move forward as part of a collective, but also keep your own individual kind of focus and capacity and talent?
Mm-hmm.
Let me add just one sentence to the previous debate.
Sure.
I think it's 3 C's that have to come together, and that's consistency, coherence, and credibility, if you really want to achieve something. And that implies for everything, not just for your communication. The question to what extent you should invest in PR is, of course, one where you have to somehow get your act together and sort out what are your priorities. As I said in my presentation, you have to take decisions. There's never an answer to PR is enough at that stage unless you have your own priorities. And for a research funding priority, of course, the most essential thing is, do we get through to the the brightest minds, the most creative minds? Do we actually invite them to apply to us? If that is the case, I think the first goal has been achieved. Mark was pointing towards this public-private interface, where I think to explain what you are doing and also to comment on things that affect your operations, etc., are essential. But at the end of the day, you see, at least in Central Europe, foundations are enjoying such a high reputation that if they would actually go on and on issuing press releases and whatever, they would really fall into the trap which many organizations have fallen into, for instance, in the 1990s. I was then still working for Max Planck, and the advice was clearly, you have, as Max Planck, such a high reputation. If you issue statements all the time, you see, the journalists will get suspicious about what you are doing and why you are doing all of a sudden so many different things. So it's consistency, I think, also in what you do in that respect that matters.
See, go ahead. See, and then Volker. Yep.
This question of leadership is interesting. There's this African proverb of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And we do both, actually, at the Rockefeller Foundation. So on our 100 Resilient Cities initiative, we want to go fast. We want to get 100 cities. There's speed. It's very different. It's very innovative. We have to make fast decisions all the time. So we actually created a nonprofit called 100 Resilient Cities, and they are moving forward. On the flip side, this notion of the Global Resilience Partnership, we're really trying to change the paradigm of development and humanitarian assistance. That requires lots of partnership, it requires some slow movement, and we're deliberately not trying to get too far ahead with our brand. So I think this question of when to lead and when to follow or lead from behind has to, be fit to, it's a value on the one hand, but I think it's also a technique that needs to be fit to purpose.
Okay. Volker.
I'd actually like to play a variation of this going fast or going far by asking those members of the audience who had just claimed to be innovative leaders, of what time frame you're thinking when it comes to that innovative leadership. Does this mean your initiatives last for 3 years, for 5 years, for 10 years? Just sort of a rough guess. It's a rolling process.
A rolling process.
So what time will you cease to be an innovative leader? How many years will that take?
Well, what's behind your question? Do you think you're a real leader if you are committed to 3 years or to 8 years?
Well, I would say it depends on the question, but I've seen foundations being as persistent and stubborn to take a seemingly impossible case through for 20 years and finally resolving the problem.
Okay.
And I've seen lots of programs that have come up in the name of innovation and sort of went by for 2 or 3 years and didn't leave a mark at all.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to say is innovation is not a matter of coming up with a different issue every 2 years. Innovation is an issue of seeing through the whole process from the first invention prompt to that stage of seeing an innovative approach and the problem solution really implemented.
Okay, Mark.
And that can take decades.
Okay, Mark's got a comment, and then we had a question over here again.
Just a slightly different take on the leadership and following question, and that's actually in how you give the money away as well. To what extent you are funding in response mode, where people are coming to you and saying, this is our great idea, will you fund it? And the extent to which you're going out to other people. And actually, I think it's quite important strategically that you delineate between the two. You decide what's responsive and what's strategic, and don't allow them to bleed into one another too much. But then also, at the same time, particularly when it comes to the responsive funding, we like to talk about the difference internally between people who are grant givers and people who are grant makers. And the grant maker is somebody comes to us with a great idea that's not there yet. And we couldn't fund it in its current form, but we would like to fund it in a form eventually. And the people, the grants advisors and the portfolio advisors that I think we really value, and the ones we think do their job outstandingly, are the ones who work with somebody who's got a great idea to develop their proposals to the point where we can actually fund it. Yeah. And I think that's something that all foundations can potentially do, is take the raw material and turn it, add value, create something that you want to fund.
Okay. Question over here.
In the Danish National Research Foundation, we fund curiosity-driven research of the highest quality. We give funding for 10 years with lots of flexibility, freedom and trust. And Dr. Kroll and co-workers evaluated the outcome of our research a year ago, made a wonderful report, and we could see that our researchers are comparable to the very best in the world, Stanford, MIT, Harvard, the best universities in Europe, or even above. So I think this being the leader, there's not a question of the length of the period. We can at least see that if you bestow people with flexibility, trust, and 10 years and a nice funding, then very good things will come out of it. And as I mentioned before the coffee break, 2% of the research in Denmark is funded by our research foundation, but 20% of the patents are also coming out from this funding. So we both get very nice outcomes in terms of research, publications, citations, but also industrial leadership in patents and spin-out companies.
Okay.
So it's a very old-fashioned way, and I don't think it's conservative, because quality is not conservative, it's an eternal value.
Thank you, very good. Any more questions before we go into our final statements? Any more? All right, one here, final question, yep.
A question for Carl. The Rockefeller Foundation, you have a quite wide scope. How do you actually select the scopes you're entering into? How did you select to go for these resilient cities? Where did it start and how did it end up on the top of your list?
Well, is your question around the entire portfolio? How do we make choices, or specifically around 100 resilient cities? General question, yes. So I think that is really one of the most central questions in philanthropy, because we can certainly try and set boundaries around what we think people should be spending their time on. On the flip side, we want our teams to be entrepreneurial and to surface opportunities. And that tension between the top-down setting boundaries and the bottom-up surfacing opportunities, that's the hard part right there. And on the one hand, we're not a corporation that really drives top-down goals and execution. On the other hand, we're not a university where everyone is free to pursue what they're interested in. So I would say that right now, I feel that we are spread too thin. There's an argument to be made that diverse involvement is helpful to us in our global influence agenda and what we're trying to do. And then there's an argument to be made that with more focus, we'd have more impact. So I would say in general, we have a process that tries to make decisions on the big areas of work, and then the individual grant making is more bottom up. It's not working as well as we would like, and as a result, we are spread a little too thin. Is probably the answer.
Okay. So we're coming to the last 5 minutes, and I'd like to ask each of you to tell us what you think the one takeaway message from today's conference should be, that our audience should take home with them or take to the dinner to discuss tonight. The one message that you think people should take home and chew on and process and digest. Who wants to go first? Jed, go ahead. He's a good sport.
I would say the takeaway is that your grant is possibly the least important thing about who you are and what you do and the possibility of what you can bring forward. that it's the power of your organization, it's the vision of your leadership, it's the capacity to network and leverage the total assets that you can draw upon that really is the beauty of what it is that you're all involved in. And so I would encourage you to focus less on the grant and to focus less on the transaction and more on the investment and the overall value that you seek to create.
Okay. Dr. Kroll?
Yeah, I think consistency is one of the main messages, and don't go away believing that there is a one-size-fits-all approach to what we've been discussing today. There are many options out there, also with respect to research funding. You see 10 years or 8 to 10 years, as we do as well, is for the high-trust model of the top-notch science. But there is much normal science to be done as well, and for that I would not recommend to go for 8 to 10 years straight away. So try to find your way according to your objectives, and not by simply saying, I've now got the right approach and that will be applied to whatever it takes. And perhaps if I may add one sentence, do not just think that you know better. We have a lot of institutions around that take this approach. We know better, we tell you what to do. Also keep a window open for those, or the door open maybe even, for those who come up with wild ideas. And that's why I think it's so essential that you do not have just one top-down approach, but that you're also open to the stakeholders in your respective community.
Very good. Volker.
Well, let me go back to your responses to the polling questions, and it was interesting to see that to many of those questions, about 70% of you responded in a certain way that would read, we're already a good way down the road and we can still improve on it. And I think this shows that we started the conversation this morning by saying you can bring much more resources than just money and funding to the fore, and we are now concluding on the same tone and account. And this would finally lead to the recommendation that even though for the whole day we have been speaking on generic issues, we've always said the foundations and the research foundations, don't ignore the wealth of traditions and patterns and cultures, given that this is an international conversation that is embodied in each of the organizations, in each of your foundations, and that actually builds those networks of trust that you can bring to your work. So I think especially when it comes to those bridges to other players, to other stakeholders, that porosity of the organization, different traditions in philanthropy and different philanthropic cultures have a lot to say about that, and so combine modesty and pride. Thank you.
Okay.
That's wonderful. That's a very difficult question that you ask, because I think there's so many rich insights that I'm taking away from this broad set of panelists. But if I had to answer it, I guess my one takeaway is to perhaps reframe the unit of analysis as not being the research foundation, but being the system or the ecosystem in which you want to operate, and what is your role in that system. And to recognize that the system is full of messages and brands and ethical perspectives and financial flows. It can get very complicated and it can get overwhelming. But I think thinking about how you want to participate almost in a market of ideas, where you will be a buyer and you will be a seller in this system, would be the right framework to think about strategy and change.
Yeah, so I want to build on this notion of system and thinking about the system, and also thinking about leaders. And so I don't really believe in leaders, but I do believe in exercising leadership. And I actually think everybody and everyone and every organization can exercise leadership within a system. And this notion of exercising leadership has to do with learning, first of all, and being open, which requires listening and collaboration. So those are sort of the themes that I pull together. I definitely think you should think of yourself as within a system. And, you know, this is sort of a very hard, you're all leaders. Where I think you can all exercise leadership is really what I think. And it's understanding that that leadership and the opportunity to exercise leadership comes in this notion of listening and collaborating.
Good.
I think probably it's that to have impact, you've really got to choose. And it doesn't really matter so much what you choose, but the fact that you do choose and you recognize that your choices have costs, and that doing one thing means you can't necessarily do something else. I think the mistake that far too many organizations, not just foundations, make is to try to do something new and try to do everything else as well, and try to end up doing too much, spread yourself too thinly, have a surfeit of priorities that means you actually have none. And but that's particularly true, I think, when it comes to communications, but I think it's true more broadly than that. You can, by choosing, you can help to define who you are, define what impact you want to have, and about how you're going to do it. And recognizing that is probably the first step to getting onto that journey.
Very good. I just want to pick up on the topic of brands one more time before we close. Every week I talk to people, I interview people who are pushing a brand. And many times those brands are pseudo brands. The brands are not good, and they're being sold as good. And what these people are wanting to do or what they have done are not good things. What I think you can take away from today is that despite all the problems, despite all the challenges that you have, what you are committed to is increasing the body of research in the world, and that in itself is a good thing, and that improves the human condition. Regardless of your degrees of porosity or how much you love pushing your brand. So with that, I think you can give yourselves a big round of applause, as well as our very good keynote speakers today who taught us a lot.